There was a local story that broke, and it came by way of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it was about a former sports talk radio host who has since pivoted into doing some weekend radio, doing Eagles sideline, causing a ruckus at virtually every press conference he attends. And now he's gone. Now, I brought this up last week. It was part of the show that Howard Eskin was leaving WIP. And then at some point last week, a story broke from the Inquirer claiming that Eskin had forcibly grabbed an employee, an Odyssey employee, somebody from WIP. And then as the details came out, it was that this forcible grabbing of this female employee happened at Chickies and Pete's. It was the same night, presumably, as the Brandon Graham show, where Brandon Graham noted that there was an issue between Jalen Hurts and A.J. Brown. There was one report that came out that Jeffrey Lurie, the Eagles owner, called Howard Eskin and was trying to get him to pull Brandon Graham off the air because of the damage that was being done by airing potential beef between Brown and Hurts. Then there was a kind of counter narrative out there that Lurie called Dom DeSandro, Big Dom, and that Dom was going to try to get to Eskin and they were going to talk. And well, within this, not a complaint, but within this story, it said that this female Odyssey employee interrupted a conversation between Eskin and Graham, that Eskin didn't take kindly to the interruption, and then at some point he touched her on the arm, and then that he might have pursued her and touched her on the arm again. She had asked him not to. The nature of what the actual content was, in my mind, is up for interpretation. I wasn't there. You weren't there. Apparently, some people were present and saw it. I brought up last week that I thought it was interesting, and I'm going to show you this, and then I'm going to dive into the story itself, because it wasn't the accusation story that did it. It was the commentary that came out that I found a little bit more interesting, and I didn't respond to it on Twitter because I just thought it was interesting that the guy who wrote it went this route. So as part of the Inquirer story, they mentioned the fact that, like, the same day that he got let go or that he parted ways with WIP, he apparently tried to get in a NovaCare center, and they didn't let him in because he didn't have a credential. And then things got even weirder because not only did he not have a credential, but he apparently tried to use the prior access that he had through Fox 29 and apparently told them that, like, he could be there because of the work that he was doing for Fox 29, but apparently he doesn't work for Fox 29 anymore. So it's just a very strange series of events that happened. And what I took exception to, and again, noting, I am not defending the guy. I don't have a reason to defend the guy. Contrary to the first story on today's, show, that from the national perspective about, did somebody kind of do things to get their way up the food chain? There's no benefit to me defending Howard Eskin. Is Howard Eskin going to get me a radio job? No. Do I want a radio job right now? No. I'm plenty busy enough. I'm just pointing out the fact that the one thing I was kind of surprised by, and maybe I shouldn't have been, is that a columnist from the Inquirer decided that now was the time to try to go after a guy who had already engaged in this alleged groping at Citizens Bank Park over the summer, who decided that many of the things within his story had happened a long time ago or were still happening, but were around his professionalism or lack thereof. And this person waited until Howard Eskin was gone from WIP before writing this. So Howard Eskin is gone. Good. The WIP's broadcaster's departure was inevitable and a long time coming. Now, keep a few things in mind. Number one, writers, even columnists, aren't necessarily the ones who come up with the headlines. Writers, columnists, aren't necessarily the ones who choose the image. We've been through this a lot of times. Quite often, they have nothing to do with the headline or the image. There's nothing inflammatory about this image. If you remember when Marcus Hayes wrote the takedown of Joel Embiid, the picture included Embiid's young son, and they changed the headline, and they changed the lead to the story, and it wasn't great. So Sielski writes this whole thing, and it starts with this. Howard Eskin's ejection from the Philadelphia sports media scene was only a matter of time. And then the revelation Thursday here in the Inquirer, that a recent confrontation with a female employee at WIP, a confrontation that turned physical, had led to a parting of ways between him and the station was hardly shocking. The ice below his feet had been spiderwebbing for months, ever since an Aramark employee had accused him of making an unwanted advance toward her. Ever since the Phillies, in turn, had banned him from Citizens Bank Park. One slightly false move and Eskin would be gone. Now he is, and more than inevitable, his departure is a long time coming. Now then he goes and he pulls back the curtain a little bit about what it's like to be a co-host of a weekend show at WIP. And he says, the greatest challenge, at least for me and those hosts who approach the job in a similar manner, is not dealing with the obnoxious callers or getting in and out of commercial breaks. It's the balancing act that you have to carry out. Nature of talk radio itself, and by the reality that WIP is an Eagles and Phillies broadcast rights holder to maintain, yada, 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 okay? Anybody who covers a team in any professional capacity, you have to do one thing first and foremost. You have to take your fan hat off. If you can't be objective, you shouldn't be covering the team, right? If you have to cover if you're covering a team that you've rooted for your entire life and you can't be fair, you can't have that job. You shouldn't be on that beat. That's one. If you are a radio personality, things are a little bit tricky, especially, and I'll give Sielski this. It is hard to be both a columnist and a radio host because as a radio host, oftentimes people are looking for you to have actual genuine emotions. They want to know where you stand on specific players and where you stand on the team. And that can be hard to do and remain objective in your reporting because if you're writing very buttoned up, straight-laced things in the Inquirer, but then you're kind of lobbing grenades on the radio, somebody could call you out and say that it's hypocritical and that you have a bias. Well, you wrote this, but what you said on the weekend was this. So I will say that, there is a certain amount of, having to be fair here. Now, I, to a much lesser extent, do this show and do Snow the Goalie and am credentialed and have a partnership with the Flyers through Snow the Goalie. And yet on this show, I'm very critical of the team. I'm very critical of the coach, critical of players. I maintain my ability to remain objective, and at the same time, I can give you my unfiltered take on the team. Perhaps there's a little bit more of a balancing act that Sielski feels like he has to do. Okay, we're going to go back over to this because there's something in here that kind of was wild. He says, Eskin never bothered to scale the ladder to the high wire. His agendas were obvious and calculated. He made no apologies for them. And then he notes that the Sixers were dopes and dogs, no matter the truth or context. Eagles were making brilliant decisions or understandable, forgivable mistakes. That's, of course, is because he was working for the Eagles. So the implication here is that Eskin was nice to the teams who gave him things, was not nice to teams that didn't give him things. Eagles gave him a job as the sideline guy, or at least endorsed his job as the sideline guy. He was nice to them, was a mouthpiece. Sixers weren't as Howard friendly, so he would constantly shit on them. He also puts this idea about Sam Hinkie. Had Sam Hinkie cozied up to him? Had Hinkie done anything other than see him for the phony sycophant he was? Phony sycophant he was. Eskin would have been one of the process's most passionate defenders instead of its loudest detractors. Now, why am I bringing all of this up? Everything that's in here, and again, you can go read the entire story over at Inquirer.com. The entire thing, his shtick, was the precursor to empty, attention-seeking economy that sprouted up in the age of social media. Grandstanding displays at press conferences. Questions intended not to gain insight, but to generate extreme reactions. Okay? And to get succulent sound bites. Insults and false narratives. All of this. Okay? All of this is in the story. But here's the problem. None of this had anything to do with what allegedly happened at Chickies and Pete's. None of this had anything to do with the alleged forcible grabbing of a female Odyssey employee. And he also, and this is the last thing, because this is the real anecdote that kind of adds a little bit of credence to all of this, that when he was younger, when Sielski was younger and he was writing columns for suburban newspapers, he bumped into Eskin, who was working for a local TV station, right, and was operating a handicapping website. And he saw that as a moral quandary, that Eskin might know more about people who were injured, and then was then giving betting advice. He snickers at the suggestion that, and he could have been doing anything wrong. He said, I never really thought about it. Actually, there's nothing you learn in a locker room that can help you. It's the biggest joke that people think you can benefit by being in a locker room, it's a joke. Why do I bring all this up? I wanted to lay out the case. Based on that story, that Howard Eskin is gone, good story, there is nothing in there that is new. There is nothing new in this story that would have otherwise changed what appears to be Sielski's opinion of Eskin. You could have just as easily published that in December as you could have in November or October or September or August or even July. This story could have run directly, immediately after the alleged contact with an Aramark employee at Citizens Bank Park that led to his suspension. So why, oh why, did Mike Sielski wait until now to publish this? Because again, many of the things that are said in there, Eskin being a grandstander, Eskin not looking for actual insightful answers, just looking for juicy sound bites. Those are things that have been said for years. I have been somehow in the local media, local sports media scene for how many years now? 7, 8? And I've heard all of these things before. And I have observed, whether in person or online or through social media, that Howard Eskin has a certain way that he goes about press conferences. He has a certain way that he covered the Eagles versus how he covered the Sixers, or his opinions on one versus the other. That has always been very clear, transparent even. So why didn't the story run? Why didn't Sielski think that it was appropriate to run this back in August? Why did he wait? And so I come back to my original tweet, which was I thought that the timing of it was interesting. Well, Sielski did a thing that you really kind of need to be careful with. He quote tweeted me in an attempt to, I guess, either clear himself or to somehow kind of like take me down a level or two or something. And he quote tweeted me with this, and I'll offer my rebuttal because I wanted to make sure that I set the stage for everyone. So again, I put the thing out and I said, also interesting that a WIP Inky writer waited until now to write a takedown. And here's what Mike Sielski had to say. Yes, I waited until now because we had broken a story about him. That's the way the business works. I wrote in 2004 that he would have been banned from the Eagles locker room. My position on him and how he did his job has been public. I suppose that's interesting. No, what's interesting is the fact that, again, there is nothing new in the story, except the fact that Howard Eskin is gone. That is one important thing. This story could have run in July around the incident at Citizens Bank Park. Sielski could have potentially used his sizable platform at the Inquirer and as a columnist and even as a radio host to call out the behavior and to say that, you know what, as credentialed media, when you go and do what was alleged to have happened with that Aramark employee, you are effectively putting every other credentialed media person in harm's way. You are essentially, to some extent, lowering the public view of what local media do because you went and got yourself involved in something you never should have. You went and did something that you never should have. And at the same time, he could have also called out the fact that Eskin had previously said to him in life, there's no value in being in the locker room. Well, then why are you there? Why are you down at the game? Now, I know some people who have been at more games, including Sixers games, that have said that Eskin did not stay for the entirety of games, often would leave early, that at Phillies games would leave early. This could have been put out in July. One could even argue that if this had been run in July, it might have applied some pressure to perhaps the station. Maybe it's time to figure out a way to send this guy off on his retirement. If they don't want to cut ties with him immediately, maybe it applies a little bit of pressure. But Sielski didn't do that. But why? Why did Sielski wait until Howard Eskin was officially gone from the station before putting out what some called a takedown, some called a hit piece? Again, the accusations at Citizens Bank Park, Chickies and Pete's, if they're true, certainly act upon them. Whatever needs to happen there. He got banned from one park. Presumably, this is what led to him being let go or parting ways with the station. But you could have done this in July and you chose not to. I go back to something I said earlier. What was happening in July last year? Oh, that's right. Mike Sielski and Howard Eskin still worked together at the station. And, oh, that's right. Howard Eskin was always viewed as a mainstay and somebody who helped build WIP into the powerhouse that it is today. And that perhaps maybe waging a public war through the Philadelphia Inquirer could have put Mike Sielski's job with WIP at risk. Oh, and by the way, Glenn Macnow was either about to or was in the process of retiring, and they were trying to figure out his successor. So perhaps Sielski sat on this story, due in part to him wanting to maintain his job at WIP in that weekend show. Maybe it was that. Now, in fairness, I can't blame Sielski for wanting to keep a very nice job on the weekend, for keeping a very nice, successful position on WIP on the weekend. That time slot that Macnow and Didinger had was widely viewed as one of the best blocks of time in the entire week in Philadelphia's sports talk radio. Now, whether or not people liked the show as much after Didinger left and Sielski came on, we're not going there. I'm not going to besmirch anybody's attempts or their efforts or what the show was or wasn't. I am simply pointing out that if Mike Sielski really wanted to write this takedown, he could have done it and released it in July. And perhaps if he had, maybe Howard Eskin doesn't have a public profile anymore. Maybe by the time December rolls around, he's not co-hosting the Brandon Graham show. Maybe he's not at an on-site event. Maybe at this point, he's off enjoying retirement, or maybe he would be. Maybe he would have been doing his own podcast. Maybe he would have gone independent, and he would have been doing a remote show. I don't know. But I think it's very interesting that Sielski could have done this last July, chose not to. Could have done it legitimately any year over the last 4 or 5 years about what an absolute joke or sycophant, as he called Eskin, the guy is. He could have released this at any point. It's an evergreen story. For all we know, Sielski could have written this 2 years ago and just kind of had it sitting on the back burner. You know, at newspapers, you often write obituaries for very public people. They just kind of sit in a folder so that if and when a Jimmy Carter dies, you have the backbone of a story ready. You're not whipping up a 2,000-word piece or a 1,200-word piece or a 500-word piece. You already have it written. And then you're going to add in some of the details. This story could have been written 5 years ago. Plug and play a couple of things. The problem that I have with it is that Sielski could have done this, could have released this, didn't, and he waited until there was no longer the threat to his job at WIP to then kick Eskin in the ass on the way out. Now, again, Eskin might be a total asshole. I don't know. I've never really interacted with the guy. And maybe Eskin was an absolute asshole to Sielski, which, if that's the case, Sielski's absolutely welcome to write a thing about what an ass Howard Eskin was. But to release it once there was no longer the moral quandary or the potential professional retribution that he might have feared that he would have faced if Eskin still had any power at the station or any sway with any of the higher-up execs, maybe at Odyssey, waiting until now to put this out just feels like kicking a guy who's already kind of fallen down the stairs. Now, some people might think that that's totally fine and totally fair. And again, it really depends on what you think about the host himself. But this could have gone out. This could have been released months ago, and it wasn't.